Well, happy Wednesday and welcome to our second video lecture in our remote economics education. I want to let you know that next week we will have a test. It'll give you a chance to show how you've been learning all the materials that we've been going through while we're distant learning. So that's going to be an exciting time. I'm still working out how that's going to work, what the test will look like, and how you'll submit the test and those sorts of details. But we'll figure it out. So I'll give you more details later on. I sent you this morning the lesson plan for the week. I'll be providing those weekly just so you can look ahead and see what's coming. Okay, so let's review what we covered yesterday at the start of chapter 10, which is controlled labor markets. And the whole premise is that pay and working conditions can be controlled by law, customs, organizations of employees or employers, and/or government officials. The point is the free market does not always prevail in employment. So prices of labor are not allowed to rise and fall as they would typical prices in the marketplace. And this chapter is about what happens when that results, when governments or labor unions get involved with the price of the market. And so a lot of this starting out was about laws that preserve jobs. Okay, they're intended to preserve employment. But why is it so bad to try and save jobs? What is the problem with that? Well, Dr. S. talked about many countries such as France and South Africa have very strict laws that make it difficult and costly to hire anybody. And this is what he says. Job security laws make it more expensive to hire workers, so labor is less in demand at the higher price. It may save the job of existing workers, but at the cost of inhibiting production of the wealth needed for the creation of new jobs. And he goes on, the very thing that makes a modern industrial society so efficient makes it impossible to keep on having the same workers doing the same jobs the same way. And we'll get into that in a little bit about some of the implications of that. The government has proven that it can sustain companies, it can sustain entire industries. It's bailed out General Motors. It looks like it's about to bail out the airlines, which are hurting during this downturn we're seeing with the COVID virus. And that brought us to our latest BHEP, which was 21. Now, this is a tough BHEP because it makes us sound like we're being heartless, and that's not at all the case. Remember our very first few lessons that as economists, we're concerned with society as a whole, and we're not concerned with certain groups that may have political connections. The free market is very efficient when prices are allowed to allocate Shraddha. And as we discussed, pay is just a way of allocating the scarce resource, which happens to be us and other people in the labor force. So BHEP 21, free market economists, us, don't care how many people lose their jobs. We care about how many new jobs are created. Okay? The question is, can people find new, more necessary jobs that help create wealth when technology or competition eliminates jobs? And when we look back at the U.S. economy, we see dozens and dozens of categories of jobs that are no longer around. I shared with you a short list of some of the jobs that have disappeared. Lector and Iceman and lamplighter, even leech collector. How would you like that job? Especially at minimum wage, which we'll get to in a few minutes. Did any of you think any other jobs that you see that might be going away? Dr. S cited the example of the sharp decrease in the number of Americans working on farms. Yet we have more food than ever in this country. Today, less than 1% of our people are employed in agriculture, and yet we not only feed our country, we're basically the market basket for much of the world. So what happened to those farm workers? They were redeployed into other manufacturing jobs or other production jobs where more wealth was generated. And we compared that to Tanzania, where 2/3 of the people in Tanzania are involved in agriculture versus our 1%. Okay, so let's get into the new material for today, specifically minimum wage laws. We already talked about what minimum wage are. It's the floor below which the price for labor is not allowed to fall. It makes it illegal to pay less than the minimum specified price for labor. The minimum wage law in the United States first started in 1938, and what was going on then? It was right at the end of the Depression, and the price, 25 cents per hour for labor. The current price of minimum wage, the federal minimum wage, is $7.25 an hour. That works out to about $15,800 per year, and it was last increased in 2009. Now, if you work in a place with tips, a restaurant or what have you, the minimum wage can be $2.13 an hour, but your tips have to bring it up to $7.25 an hour, or their employer has to make up the balance. And there's also provisions such as, some of you may have seen this, if you're under age 20, employer can hire you for less than the minimum wage for the first 90 days. After that, you're subject to the minimum wage. But as Dr. S points out, states and even cities have their own minimum wage laws, and they are always higher, of course, than the federal minimum wage. And by law, the employer has to pay the higher of the two, either the federal law or the state law. And what we see is the bigger states, typically run by Democrat governors and legislators, tend to have the highest minimum wage. For example, California's minimum wage is $12 an hour. Washington State, just north of there, is $13.50. New York is $11.80, and New Jersey is $11 an hour. A number of states use the federal standards. Others just have no minimum wage laws, so the federal law applies. And here in Florida, the minimum is $8.56 an hour, and that goes up a little bit every year. There's a formula that's by law enshrined in there, and that helps to set the minimum wage. But as I mentioned, many cities have their own minimum wage. New York, Seattle, San Francisco, and Washington, D.C. all have minimum wages of $15 an hour or more, and some of them are set to increase over time. And it's not just in the U.S. where we find minimum wage laws. New Zealand was the first country with minimum wage laws in 1894, and today about 90% of countries have some kind of minimum wage laws, but they're not always universally popular. The Swiss, for example, overwhelmingly by over 2/3, rejected a law that would have raised their minimum wage to almost $25 an hour. That's a pretty nice minimum wage. And as we talked about a lesson or two ago, the problem with wages as prices is that all economic sense gets put aside when we're talking about people, and we hear things like living wage and fair wages and paid what they're worth and those sorts of things. So it's very controversial, but most economists agree that certain things will happen when you artificially raise prices. Dr. S tells us a price artificially raised causes more to be supplied, in this case labor, and less to be demanded, and therefore more unemployment. And making it illegal to pay less than a set amount does not automatically make workers worth that. So just because the law says we're worth $15 an hour, if we go back to a previous chapter, we'll see that if the productivity is not making $15 an hour, that job will not be filled. So the University of Chicago, which has a fairly conservative school of economics, they did a survey of other economists throughout the nation, and they found that the economists reported that raising the minimum wage would make it noticeably harder for poor workers to find jobs. And here's kind of the key point. Dr. S says, the real minimum wage is always zero, regardless of the law, and that is the wage that many workers receive in the wake of minimum wage laws. And it's funny because these proposed minimum wage laws are always arbitrary and are not based on sound economic analysis. So President Obama, when he was president, he pressed hard for a federal minimum wage of $10.10 an hour. But why did he pick $10.10 and not $11.10 or $9.10? Right now, most Democrats, presidential candidates, there's only a few, but all of them endorse that, were endorsing at least $15 an hour. But why not $16 an hour or $14 an hour? They just kind of pluck these numbers from the air. So the American Enterprise Institute, which is a free market think tank, they have written extensively on minimum wage. The Institute says minimum wage laws require costly taxpayer-funded monitoring and enforcement mechanisms, whereas market wages do not. The market is self-correcting. Minimum wage laws discriminate against unskilled workers in favor of skilled workers, and the greatest amount of discrimination takes place against minority groups such as blacks and Hispanics. The American Enterprise Institute says minimum wage laws disadvantage workers in the form of reduced hours, reduced fringe benefits, and reduced on-the-job training. So if we had to boil it down, we talked about prices when we're buying a cup of yogurt or we're buying a house or whatever. We mutually agree with the seller and we have a mutually agreed upon transaction. Both sides agree to the transaction. Minimum wage laws do not allow that to happen. If I want to go to work for $7 an hour, I'm not allowed to. If my employer wants to pay me $7 an hour, we can't do that. That would be against the law. So we violated one of the basic forms of economics here when we do that. Market-determined wages are efficient, according to the American Enterprise Institute, whereas government-mandated wages create distortions in the labor market that prevent labor markets from clearing, in other words, moving out people and get them into jobs and getting them advancing in their careers. Here's a quote from them. Like all government price controls, minimum wage laws are distortionary. If you trust government officials and politicians to legislate and enforce a minimum wage for unskilled workers, you should logically trust those same bureaucrats to set all prices. Yikes! Wages and interest rates in the economy. Realistically, if you agree that these economy-wide price controls would be undesirable, then you should also agree that the minimum wage is also undesirable. So Dr. S says, minimum wage laws are very beneficial to those who keep the jobs, but they're detrimental to those who lose their jobs, or more importantly, don't get hired. Remember he said the real minimum wage is zero if you don't get hired? And that's true. And we've seen that in the cities that have raised the minimum wage to $15 an hour. There's a lot less employment because many restaurants have shut down. They just can't pay, a Subway can't pay $15 an hour for people that make Subways. Even though I'm willing to go to work for $10 an hour, they would have to pay me $15 an hour. So what group is most impacted by minimum wage? Well, simply stated, your demographic and minorities. So if we look, right now we see that there's a 17% unemployment rate for blacks aged 16 to 24, and that's what in the United States we call youth unemployment. It's 8% for whites. Now, these numbers will go up with the impact of the virus because a lot of people aren't working. I know some of you have jobs that I'm sure have gone away, or at least are on hold during the interim. Okay, if we were going to summarize the effects of minimum wage, it would be this. We have lower overall employment. We have higher unemployment among youth and minorities. There's more poverty because we have fewer jobs. And employers, they can cherry pick the best people. So when they have a big group of people to choose from, they can just take the one that's got the whatever, maybe the best looking or most physical skills, whatever. They can take the best people. Importantly, we see, as we saw a couple days ago, the substitution of labor for capital. And we see that now when we go to a Wawa and we order on an iPad, or we go to McDonald's and we go over to the kiosk and we order and pay there, rather than dealing with somebody, a human being who's making a wage and doing that transaction. We see higher prices because if I'm running a Subway sandwich shop and I've got to pay $15 an hour, I can't just automatically keep my prices if I'm the same as when they were paying $10 an hour. So I can either go out of business or I can try and raise my rates. And we'll probably see lower quality. I won't have as many tomatoes, which are expensive, that sorts of things. And as Dr. S points out, it results in higher wages for unionized employees because unions are all in favor of higher minimum wage, even though there's not a union on the planet that makes union worker on the planet that makes minimum wage. It's because they're in their contracts are typically indexed to minimum wage laws. They'll make 2x the minimum wage or whatever. They've got that baked into it. So, okay, final thoughts on minimum wage. So who are the minimum wage workers? Well, on the whole, they tend to be young. Although workers under the age of 25 represent only about 1/5 of hourly workers, people who get paid by the hour, they make up half of those who make the federal minimum wage. Okay? Among employed teenagers paid by the hour, about 23% earn the minimum wage or less, compared with only 3% of workers over age 25 make the minimum wage. Okay. And where do we find the highest percentage of minimum wage workers? Well, it's where you would expect. We find it in the hospitality industry, specifically food, restaurants, and hotels. Nearly 3/5 of all the workers paid at or below the federal minimum wage are in this industry, and the vast majority in restaurants and other food service. For many workers, tips may supplement the wages received. So anyway, that's a whirlwind through the minimum wage. So thanks for watching, and we will check in with you tomorrow with the assignments, and happy Wednesday. Bye-bye.